Okay, so yesterday morning we got a new Nintendo Direct, and Nintendo revealed a lot of games. In fact, if you actually look at how many games they typically reveal per Nintendo Direct, it was one of the biggest Directs they've ever done in terms of new game announcements, not even counting the remakes and upgrades and stuff like that. There were 4 fully new Nintendo Switch 2 exclusive games announced, plus all the other stuff. People are really upset about this Nintendo Direct, and one phrase, one sentence that I've seen more than ever before is that, quote, Switch 2 has no games, which, if you are on the internet a lot, you will know is something that has been said about the PS5 for many years, because most PS5 games at the early days were on PS4, then they started coming to PC, so the PS5 doesn't have that many true exclusives. And now that same sentiment is being put onto the Switch 2, which, as someone who has been covering Nintendo on YouTube for over 10 years now, since the early Wii U days, as someone who plays games on all platforms, as you can see, I have PS5 games. There are a couple games on PS5 there. I really don't get why people are coming to this conclusion, and a lot of the issues people have with the Direct of like, oh, there weren't any system sellers, oh, where was this game? I'm kind of just left scratching my head wondering, like, well, why does it matter if Yoshi's not a system seller? If that game doesn't look fun to you, that's fine, but why does it matter to you that game won't move consoles? If you want to play it, just play it. Why do you care what Nintendo's bottom line is? So that's what we're getting into today, this entire narrative that the Switch 2 has no games. We're going to bring the receipts. We're going to disprove it. And I've even had people in my replies and in my comments saying, oh, if you were there for the Switch 1, this is the worst year one for a Nintendo console ever. The Switch 1 was way better. Quite objectively, it wasn't. But if you are new here and you enjoy Nintendo Switch 2 discussions, I would appreciate you liking the video and subscribing. Let's get into it. All right, so I put out this tweet yesterday, late last night before going to bed, and my friend Tucker made this graph. It's basically every Nintendo game from the beginning of 2025 through what we have announced, including all of the Switch 2 upgrades and stuff, all the free patches, just to really demonstrate how much Nintendo has released. And as you can see, I mean, 3.7k likes, people widely are agreeing, but if you go on the replies, it is a mess in there. People are going crazy trying to disprove it. They're making images showing like, okay, well, actually this is a tech demo here, and drag and drive isn't very good, so we're not going to count it. And also all of these Switch 2 upgrades don't count because, well, they're just upgrades to Switch 1 games. However, even when you remove all of that stuff, every game that you could put an asterisk on, there are still over 10 Switch 2 exclusives that are releasing between now. Of course, we already had Mario Kart World and Bonanza, and then into 2026. There are so many Switch 2 exclusives that honestly, I'm having trouble to think if there's ever been any console that has ever had this many exclusives from first party, except for, like, you know, the NES with all the black box games that released. We had Mario Kart World, then Bonanza, then we had Drag and Drive, which I know some people don't want to count it, but objectively it does count, especially if we compare it to the Switch 1, where, you know, 1-2 Switch is one of those games, right? We would count that, so I would say we would count that and Welcome Tour personally, but even for the sake of the argument, let's not count Welcome Tour for some reason. We won't count Pokemon because that's on Switch 1, even though we'll get to that entire thing. I think that's so stupid. Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, Kirby Air Riders, Mario Tennis Fever, Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, Splatoon Raiders, Pokemon Pokopia, Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, and the Duskbloods from Software. That is a substantial lineup to have already released a couple of those games, but also have all of these games announced for the holiday season and into next year when it's only September. We all know how Nintendo operates, unless we have amnesia now. Nintendo waits until they're close to releasing a game to announce it normally. We saw that, of course, yesterday with Mario Tennis Fever. That game's coming out in just a few months, but then we also saw some games that are a little bit further out, like Pokemon Pokopia and Splatoon Raiders. Well, that was announced, and we don't have an exact window, but presumably is a 2026 game. By my count, that is 11 Switch 2 exclusives releasing roughly in the first 12 months. Maybe you extend that a little bit beyond if Splatoon is like a later summer game next year. Same with Pokemon Pokopia. And, you know, 12 if you include Welcome Tour, which I personally think you should if you count 1-2 Switch as a Switch 1 game, because that is also a tech demo. 12 games in roughly the first year, not even counting everything else going on, not counting any Switch 2 editions, not counting any of the free patches, and most importantly, not counting Metroid Prime or Pokemon. Those are two of their big games this holiday, and for some reason, there has been this idea that if a game is not truly like 100% exclusive, it doesn't count as a game, and it's not a system seller. I do not know where this narrative came from. I did not see it back when the PS4 released and stuff like The Last of Us Remastered came out and like Tomb Raider and all these PS3 games, GTA 5, when all these PS3 and 360 games started getting remastered for PS4, there wasn't this idea that, oh, that no one's going to want to buy the PS4 because the biggest game is GTA 5 and The Last of Us Remastered. No, people bought that console, and those games ended up being some of the best-selling PS4 games, even though the early years of PS4 really didn't have that much. It wasn't until 2016, 2017 that the exclusive lineup there really started to ramp up. The same thing can be said of PS5, which is when I started seeing this idea of like, oh, if a game is not exclusive, it doesn't count towards the list, right? PS5 has no games is something I've seen parroted literally thousands of times over the past 5 years, and I do think there is certainly some room for criticism of Sony's first-party lineup. Of course, they had the whole live service initiative that completely failed, and those first couple of years, yeah, the games were on PS4. God of War Ragnarok, Horizon Forbidden West, even something like Gran Turismo 7. Most of the tentpole exclusives on PS5 were on PS4, and then the games that were PS5 exclusive, like Spider-Man 2 and Returnal, those ended up going to PC, so that's where the entire PS5 has no games narrative came from. But then you actually look at the reality of the situation and how these consoles and these games sell, where the PS5, at least for those first couple of years when there were no true exclusives, it was the fastest selling PlayStation console of all time. I think it might still be. It's certainly on track to outsell the PS4, which is already the second best selling PlayStation console, and God of War Ragnarok, Horizon Forbidden West. All of these games sold best on PS5 despite being on PS4. So objectively, those games, like God of War Ragnarok, that was a PS5 system seller. I am seeing people in my Discord server, but also on social media, say that Pokemon Legends EA, and to a lesser extent Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, do not count as Switch 2 games because no one's going to buy a Switch 2 to play these games. Because they already have a Switch 1, they can play them on Switch 1. Why would they buy a Switch 2 to play these games? If you do not think that Pokemon Legends EA is a system seller for the Switch 2, I don't know if you've just never paid attention to how people buy video game consoles or how much people are foaming at the mouth for Pokemon. I personally am excited for the game, but that wasn't really until recently when I went hands-on with it at PAX West. I think the game looks okay. I mean, I love Kalos, but visually I'm not super impressed by Legends EA, and the gameplay is a little weird, so it's not even a game I'm like through the roof excited for, but you know, I'm interested in it. But if you think that game is not a Switch 2 system seller, here's my question for you. Why is Nintendo selling a bundle for the Switch 2 with it? Because they know it's a system seller. That is a bigger system seller than probably Donkey Kong Bonanza, to be honest to you. That is a new Pokemon game on the Switch 2. Yes, it's on Switch 1, but, well, we saw what happened with Scarlet and Violet. Those games ran like doo-doo on the Switch 1. When we get on the other end of 2025, I promise you Legends EA will be the second best-selling Switch 2 game, at least for a time, just behind Mario Kart World, ahead of Bonanza, and then eventually it'll fall because it is just one game, it's not a pair of games, and then Generation 10 will release, and all these other exclusives will release. But Legends EA is the big holiday game for Nintendo this year. It's not Prime 4. Prime 4 will sell Switch 2 units to the very hardcore Nintendo fan base, but it is just a Metroid game. These games do never, sell incredibly well. I mean, they certainly do well for what they are. And then Kirby Air Riders, I think, will do pretty well as well, but once again, kind of this weird niche racing battle game that I don't think necessarily will move units. And then Hyrule Warriors, of course, is cool. I like Warriors games, but I know they're not for everybody. But it is a Zelda IP, so that'll certainly help a little bit. So when you're looking at this holiday lineup, the system seller is Legends EA, and I do not understand this idea that because it's on Switch 1, people will not buy it. We literally have receipts to prove that a game being cross-gen does not matter. Look at God of War Ragnarok, look at Horizon Forbidden West, look at all of those PS5 games that people claim the PS5 doesn't have. Those games sold the PS5. That is undisputable, and we know Nintendo is going for that same strategy with Legends EA because, well, they're bundling the damn game with the console. Clearly, they know it's going to be a system seller. They wouldn't just do that arbitrarily. But also, and I definitely want to talk about this in this video, why are Nintendo fans, and I say this as a YouTuber, but why are Nintendo fans so obsessed with a game being a system seller? Why does that add more perceived value to you as the gamer, and why does that get you more excited for a game? I understand one of the big tentpoles like a 3D Mario or Animal Crossing, but I wanted to read this reply from a fellow YouTuber, Super Mario T, on Twitter. He replied to me, and this comment I think encapsulates perfectly what I've seen so much in the past like 6 or 7 months regarding Nintendo. And let me preface this by saying, I love talking about sales data. As you all know, I am always making videos on their financial reports talking about how much a game sells. I think it's a lot of fun, but we're getting to the point where I think people are letting it hamper their enjoyment of Nintendo Directs, but also make them look at the lineup way more analytically than we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to look at the game. If it's fun, we want to buy it. If it doesn't look up our alley, we do not buy it. It's as simple as that. We don't need to be looking at every game through the lens of, okay, but is Yoshi in the Mysterious Book going to sell a console? But I wanted to read this reply on Twitter here. He said, I know people hate devil's advocates, but while there are a lot of good games on the horizon, I find it hard to believe any of them will push Switch 2 units and sell really well amongst the majority of consumers. Almost all of them are either cross-gen or not that broadly appealing. So we already talked about the cross-gen thing. I think it is so foolish to think that Legends EA is not a system seller. I mean, it's a Pokemon game. That is the most broadly appealing thing that Nintendo releases, aside from Mario Kart, which once again is already out. But even beyond just the cross-gen and Pokemon thing, why are we so obsessed with the idea that a game has to be broadly appealing to the majority of consumers to be exciting? That's not how Nintendo has ever operated. There's never been a lineup where every single game they release is going to be, a 10 million plus seller. That's not the reality that we live in. That's not how the Switch 1 first year was, certainly not. But let's play along. Let's talk about what games that they have announced right now are system sellers, games that are broadly appealing and will move units. So we already have Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza. Mario Kart World, I know the Nintendo hardcore community will tell you that game is dead. Let's be real with ourselves, guys. It's a Mario Kart game. I agree, they should have had an update in the Direct yesterday or something, to put some life into it, but it is Mario Kart. That game is probably going to sell 30 or 40 million copies. It will become one of the best-selling games of all time, top 20 or whatever. But then you also have Donkey Kong Bonanza, which, for all intents and purposes, is an exclusive 3D Mario game. I know it's not literally Mario, but it is a 3D platformer by the same team that makes 3D Mario, so that, of course, is a system seller. And then the next major release, not counting Dragon Drive, after that is Pokemon, which, once again, cross-gen. It's a new Pokemon game on their new console. They've never had a Pokemon game in year one. That is going to be absolutely massive, especially in Japan for this console. Then you have Hyrule Warriors. I don't think that will necessarily move the needle. Kirby Air Riders, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. We're talking maybe a couple people buy the console for that specific game, but they are not the broadly appealing games that Super Mario T is talking about here. Neither is Mario Tennis Fever, neither is Yoshi and the Mysterious Book. And then we get down to the final row of 2026 games, which Tomodachi Life not confirmed for Switch 2. I think there will be a Switch 2 edition, in which case that will end up being a system seller. Frankly, even if there's not a Switch 2 edition, a lot of people will buy the Switch 2 just to play that game on their Switch, because, well, I think there's a lot of lapsed Animal Crossing fans that maybe sold their Switch back in 2020 after they got done with the game. Tomodachi Life, we already know, is going to be huge based on the social media reaction. That game is going to sell a lot of copies. I think that is a system seller, even if it doesn't have a Switch 2 version, but I do think it will have one. But not even counting that, not counting, of course, Rhythm Heaven. I wish Rhythm Heaven was that big, but it's not. But then we get to two that I do think people are really underselling. Splatoon Raiders is a new Splatoon game. That is one of Nintendo's most broadly appealing franchises. Every Splatoon game so far has sold over 10 million copies. This is an exclusive Switch 2 Splatoon game. Once again, presumably coming out next year, since they announced it back in June. And then Pokemon Pokopia. This is a Pokemon Animal Crossing game. This was announced in the Nintendo Direct yesterday. I know a lot of Nintendo fans kind of separate Pokemon in their minds, and it's not quite the same as the rest of Nintendo's franchises, but Pokemon Pokopia is, without a doubt, a system seller. That is kind of a recipe for success right there. They're literally making a Pokemon Animal Crossing game. And while I think visually, once again, underwhelming, as per usual for Pokemon, the people that play these types of games don't really care. This, combined with Tomodachi Life, is going to sell a lot of Nintendo Switch 2 units next year, because Pokemon Pokopia is actually a Switch 2 exclusive. People are really sleeping on this one. I don't really know why, other than just people not caring about Pokemon, which I mean, that's fine. But when it comes time for this game to release, I think we're going to see it blowing up in a way that, not obviously like we saw Animal Crossing blowing up, because that was very specific circumstances, but it's going to be very popular, just like we saw with Fantasy Life earlier this year on Switch 1 and then on Switch 2. Even that, without any Nintendo IP tied to it, did extremely well on Nintendo platforms. Pokopia and Splatoon Raiders are very broadly appealing system sellers. And then, yeah, you do have the games that cater more towards a specific audience. I would actually argue that the Duskbloods is a pretty broadly appealing game, not a Nintendo IP, but it is a Switch 2 exclusive. From Software Games sell tens of millions of copies now. even Elden Ring Night Reign, which is a multiplayer game just like the Duskbloods, sold a lot of copies. The Duskbloods is going to get a lot of people on board with the Switch 2 next year. Fire Emblem, not a system seller, but catering to a very specific niche of Nintendo fans. That is a great game to have in the first 12 to 18 months. And then you have all these other games rounding out the lineup, so there's basically a pretty big game every single month, like Mario Tennis Fever, which will sell probably 3 to 5 million copies. Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, which will sell millions of copies. Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, which will sell millions of copies. Prime 4, which is a hardcore Nintendo game fans have been waiting literally, almost 2 decades for. Same thing with Kirby Air Riders. We never thought we would get a Kirby Air Ride sequel. I just struggle, even removing every Switch 2 edition and every, port, remaster, Galaxy 1 and 2, removing all of that stuff. How could you possibly look at this lineup and think there's not enough? How could you possibly look at this lineup and say the Switch 2 has no games? Because now what we're going to do is compare it to the Switch 1 lineup. Because I'm getting a lot of responses like this one right here that say, there is no way y'all were there for 2017 if you think this is what the first year of a Nintendo Switch sequel should look like. Okay, so taking a look at Switch 1's year 1, so we're going from March 3rd, 2017 through to 2018. We had 1-2 Switch, Breath of the Wild, Mario Kart 8, ARMS, Splatoon 2, Mario Rabbids, which they didn't publish, but we'll count it, especially if we're counting Duskbloods on the Switch 2, Pokken Tournament Deluxe, Fire Emblem Warriors, Super Mario Odyssey, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Now, to the people saying Switch 2 has no games, to the people discrediting something like Pokemon Legends ZA or Prime 4 Beyond, or even something like Tomodachi Life, frankly, I ask you this. Do you know how many of these games are actually exclusive? Because if we play the same game of removing cross-gen releases or ports, or even games that we frankly feel are lesser in value, like a Welcome Tour or a Dragon Drive, this list becomes very small very quickly. The Legend of Zelda was on the Wii U. 1-2 Switch is a tech demo. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, also on the Wii U. ARMS, I'll give you that, but once again, that's not a broadly appealing title. That's a very niche fighting game that sold pretty well for what it was, but even then, it's not a game people really regarded that highly. Splatoon 2, I would say that was the first big, true Switch 1 exclusive game. Then you get Mario Rabbids, which did very well for Ubisoft because they sell their games for $10 half the time. Pokken Tournament Deluxe, that's a Wii U game. Fire Emblem Warriors was on the 3DS. That wasn't exclusive to the Switch 2. So really what you're looking at for the first year of Switch 1 in terms of exclusive first-party Nintendo Switch software is Snipper Clips, ARMS, Splatoon 2, Mario Rabbids, Mario Odyssey, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Only 2 of those games, I would say, are broadly appealing system sellers, being Splatoon 2 and Super Mario Odyssey. And then in 2018, the first couple months didn't really have much in that first, 12-month period. Star Allies came out at the end of March of that year, so if you want to count that, we can. And then Bayonetta 1 and 2 reports as well. So 5 to maybe 6 actual Switch 1 exclusive games from Nintendo released in the first year of the Switch 1. And only 2 of those games are the broadly appealing system-selling exclusive that these people seem to think the Switch 2 should have, every single month. Comparing that to Switch 2, once again, it's not even close. Even if you don't count the Switch 2 editions, which you should, just looking at the bigger games, not counting Welcome to our Dragon Drive, we didn't count 1-2 Switch, so we won't count those. Mario Kart World, Bonanza, Hyrule Warriors, Kirby Air Riders, Mario Tennis, Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, Splatoon Raiders, Pocopia, Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, Duskbloods. That's 10 games right there, and yeah, some of those will slip certainly past June 5th, 2026. But even if you extend the window of Switch 1, 2018 wasn't this banger year that people seem to think it was. You had a Mario Tennis game in there, which is pretty comparable to Tennis Fever, obviously. And then you had ports of Captain Toad and Donkey Kong and Hyrule Warriors. It was almost all ports. And I love year 1 of the Switch 1 because, well, I like Nintendo games, and I don't discredit Breath of the Wild for being on the Wii U. I just enjoyed Breath of the Wild for what it was. But for some reason now, we don't think like that anymore. Pokemon Legends ZA doesn't count as a Switch 2 thing because it's on Switch 1. Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, nah, my enjoyment of that is arbitrarily hampered because I know it's a Switch 1 game. I just don't understand how we got to this point. People did not used to think this way. Our brains did not used to be wired to only thinking that exclusives mattered, and it's just kind of annoying, to be honest. I know this video is going to get a lot of heated comments down below. I know it's going to get a lot of dislikes because, well, hating on Nintendo is the popular thing, and I certainly will not defend a lot of their pricing practices with Galaxy 1 and 2 and the $50 Kirby amiibo, or even announcing that Legends ZA DLC now. I think all of these things are very easily avoidable missteps on their part in terms of, well, maybe make those amiibo a little bit cheaper, maybe announce that DLC after the game releases. But it's just frustrating to see this widespread narrative online that there are no games, and just seeing how miserable people are and nobody can ever be happy. And the funniest part is about all of this, we're just talking first party. If we compare Switch 2 to Switch 1 first year and include third party, oh my goodness, it's not even close. The Switch 2 has the best third-party support that Nintendo has had maybe since the SNES. I guess you could maybe argue GameCube had pretty good support there for a little bit, but we're getting stuff like Resident Evil Requiem and Borderlands 4 and that 007 game. We're getting these major AAA titles in the first year on top of all these ports, and yeah, I know they're ports, but you look at the Switch 1 year one lineup for third-party, and there was, I mean, Doom and Skyrim at the end of the year, but other than that, there was almost nothing. There were weeks at a time where you could go on the eShop and find a cool indie game, but that hasn't been the case here. Every single week on the Switch 2, there have been pretty big third-party games to play, sometimes multiple, sometimes half a dozen, like last week with Star Wars and Hollow Knight and Daemon X Machina and Chronos. Like, I understand we all want to see the next 3D Mario game and the next Animal Crossing game, but I feel like people are letting that cloud their judgments and making them look back at 2017 and just other Nintendo first-year lineups with these rose-tinted glasses that just objectively are not true. We will see if Kirby Air Riders and Prime 4 and Pokemon and Hyrule Warriors and Yoshi and Mario Tennis, we'll see if all these games are good, and maybe they'll all be really bad, and we'll look back at this year one lineup as like, oh, there was a lot of games, but they were all bad, and yeah, that would be unfortunate. So to look at the first-party lineup and third-party lineup for the Switch 2 and to say there's nothing to play, that is just categorically not true. To say there aren't enough system sellers, first of all, I don't really know why we're so concerned if the system sells, especially when all that rhetoric is coming from people that already own the system. But even disregarding that, it's also not true. There are plenty of system sellers on the Switch 2. I don't know. I don't know how we got to this point. If you're one of the people that think this lineup is like really bad, I'm genuinely asking this, what do you want?